Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through their window, and everything seemed normal. But as Peppa turned to wake up George, she noticed something strange. His eyes were completely black, like two dark holes in his pink face. George smiled at her, but it wasn't his usual innocent smile. His teeth had grown sharp and pointed. "Good morning, Peppa," he said in a voice that didn't sound quite right. It was deeper, older, and had an echo that seemed to come from somewhere far away. Peppa felt a chill run down her spine, but she tried to convince herself that she was still dreaming. She rubbed her eyes and looked again, but George's appearance remained the same. His black eyes seemed to stare right through her. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast as usual, but when Peppa entered the kitchen, she gasped. Mummy Pig was humming a haunting melody that made the air feel heavy and cold. When she finally turned around, her face was exactly the same as George's, black eyes and razor-sharp teeth. "Good morning, my dear," Mummy Pig said in that same echoing voice. "Would you like some breakfast?" She held up a plate of what looked like normal bacon and eggs, but the bacon was moving slightly. Daddy Pig appeared in the doorway, and Peppa's heart sank. He too had the same terrifying transformation. The black eyes that seemed to absorb all light, and the menacing smile full of sharp teeth. "What a lovely morning for a family outing," he said. Peppa realized that she was the only one who remained unchanged. She was trapped in her own home with her family, but they were no longer the loving family she knew. They moved differently now, their movements too smooth and coordinated. The house itself began to change around her. The cheerful yellow walls started to fade to a sickly gray color, and the windows grew darker despite the bright morning outside. The familiar furniture seemed to shift and warp when she wasn't looking directly at it. As the day progressed, more characters appeared, each one transformed in the same horrifying way. Susie Sheep arrived with her black eyes gleaming. Pedro Pony's usually friendly neigh had become a bone-chilling sound. They all gathered around Peppa, forming a circle in the living room. Their black eyes never blinked, and their sharp-toothed smiles never faltered. They began to speak in unison. "Join us, Peppa," they chanted. "Become like us." Peppa tried to run, but every door she reached led back to the same room where her transformed family waited. The house had become a maze. As night fell, the transformation of her world was complete. The once bright and cheerful house had become a dark, twisted version of itself. And slowly, inevitably, Peppa began to feel the change starting within herself. Her reflection in the mirror showed the first signs, tiny black specks appearing in her eyes. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa noticed something strange about her bedroom. The familiar yellow walls seemed darker, and the cheerful drawings appeared to be watching her with hollow eyes. George was asleep, clutching his dinosaur toy, but even Mr. Dinosaur looked different. His plastic smile seemed wider, more sinister. Peppa climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The house was unnaturally quiet. Usually she could hear Mummy and Daddy Pig talking downstairs, but tonight there was only silence. Even the wall clock had stopped ticking. As hours passed, Peppa began hearing soft whispers from the walls themselves. The voices sounded like her family, but the words were backwards, in a language she couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder until they filled the entire room. George stirred and opened his eyes, but they weren't the warm brown eyes Peppa knew. They were completely black, like empty holes. He sat up slowly, his movements jerky like a broken puppet. When he spoke, his voice was deeper, older than it should be. The bedroom walls began to shift, the blue paint peeling away to reveal something dark underneath. The furniture started melting into twisted, impossible forms. The bunk bed stretched upward, growing taller until it disappeared into shadows above. Peppa tried calling for her parents, but her voice came out as a whisper. She heard footsteps in the hallway, too heavy to be Mummy's, too slow to be Daddy's. The footsteps stopped outside her door, and the handle began turning with a grinding sound. The door opened, revealing Daddy Pig.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa discovered an old music box in Grandpa Pig's attic. The delicate ballerina inside spun slowly to a haunting melody that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. When Peppa wound the key, the music grew louder, and the walls of the house began to shimmer like water. Suddenly, Peppa found herself in a twisted version of her own home. The yellow walls had turned a sickly green, and the familiar furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs. The family portraits on the walls showed faces she didn't recognize, yet they looked strangely familiar. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she walked through the corridors. George appeared at the top of the stairs, but something was wrong. His usual cheerful expression was replaced by a blank stare, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. He kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "The music box knows your name, Peppa." Mummy Pig emerged from the kitchen, but her movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. She smiled too widely, showing teeth that were far too sharp. "Time for dinner, Peppa," she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "We've been waiting for you to join us." The dining room table was set for 5, but there were only 4 family members. The 5th chair sat empty, waiting. On each plate was the same meal they had eaten yesterday, and the day before, and every day for what felt like forever. The food never spoiled, never changed, never disappeared. Daddy Pig sat at the head of the table, his glasses reflecting not the room around them, but scenes from Peppa's memories. Happy moments from her past played out in the lenses like tiny television screens. But as she watched, the memories began to change. The smiles became frowns, the laughter turned to whispers, and the bright colors faded to gray. The music box melody continued to play, growing louder and more distorted with each passing moment. Peppa realized that every time the ballerina completed a full turn, something in the house changed. A door would appear where there wasn't one before, or a window would show a different view entirely. She tried to leave, but every door she opened led back to the same dining room. The family sat motionless, waiting for her to take her seat. Their eyes never blinked, their smiles never wavered. The empty chair seemed to pull her toward it with an invisible force. As Peppa approached the table, she noticed that her reflection in Daddy Pig's glasses was different. The Peppa in the reflection was already sitting in the empty chair, already part of this strange family dinner that never ended. The reflection waved at her, beckoning her to join. The music box finally wound down, and in the sudden silence, Peppa heard her own voice coming from the empty chair. "Welcome home, Peppa. We've been waiting for you to remember who you really are." The ballerina in the music box had stopped spinning, but now it was facing Peppa directly, its tiny painted eyes staring right at her. When Peppa blinked, she was sitting in the empty chair, and another version of herself was standing by the music box looking confused and frightened. The cycle was beginning again, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of a music box starting to play. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom, but something felt different today. The sunlight seemed dimmer than usual, and the familiar sounds of birds chirping were strangely absent. Peppa looked around the room. Everything appeared normal, but George was sleeping too peacefully, almost unnaturally still. As Peppa got dressed, she noticed that her reflection in the mirror lagged behind her movements. She waved her hand, and her reflection waved back a moment later. Curious, she moved closer to the mirror. For just an instant, she saw another Peppa on the other side, one with completely black eyes and a smile that stretched too wide across her face. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by eerie silence. When Peppa entered the kitchen, Mummy Pig turned around with her characteristic smile, but her eyes seemed to follow Peppa wherever she moved, never blinking. "Good morning, Peppa," Mummy Pig said in her normal voice, but the words echoed strangely. "Would you like some breakfast?" Peppa sat down at the table. The cereal looked normal, but the milk had turned a peculiar shade of gray. She forced herself to eat, though each bite tasted like nothing at all. George came downstairs dragging his dinosaur toy, but Peppa noticed that his shadow on the wall didn't match his movements. While George walked normally, His shadow danced and twirled independently. When George sat down, his shadow remained standing, swaying like it was listening to music only it could hear. Daddy Pig entered, adjusting his glasses. But today, when light hit his glasses, Peppa could see tiny figures moving inside the lenses, miniature versions of their family, trapped behind the glass, silently screaming and pounding on the surface. "What shall we do today?" Daddy Pig asked, his voice sounding distant, even though he was standing right next to them. Peppa suggested they visit Grandpa Pig, hoping that leaving the house might make everything normal again. But as they prepared to leave, she noticed that all the family photos on the walls had changed. In every picture, their faces had been replaced with blank, featureless ovals. The car ride felt longer than usual. The countryside looked the same, but there were no other cars, no people, no animals. It was as if they were the only living things left. Even the trees seemed to watch them, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. When they arrived at Grandpa Pig's house, everything appeared normal from outside. But when Grandpa Pig opened the door, Peppa gasped. He looked exactly like himself, but he was completely transparent, like a ghost made of glass. She could see right through him to the hallway behind. "Welcome, my dear family," Grandpa Pig said, his voice echoing as if from the bottom of a deep well. "We've been waiting for you for such a long time." As they entered the house, Peppa realized that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the window and everything seemed normal. But something was different about their toys. The teddy bears were facing the wall, and Mr. Dinosaur was lying upside down. Peppa noticed that George's favorite dinosaur toy had strange new markings, dark lines that looked like scratches. When George picked up Mr. Dinosaur, it felt unusually cold, and for just a moment, Peppa could have sworn she saw its plastic eyes blink. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her movements were mechanical. She kept stirring the same bowl over and over, her smile frozen in place. When Peppa said good morning, Mummy Pig turned around slowly, and her eyes seemed to look right through her. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper, but the pages were completely blank. He kept turning them anyway, nodding and chuckling at nothing. When Peppa asked what was so funny, Daddy Pig just stared at her with that same empty smile. At playgroup, all of Peppa's friends were there, but they were different. Susie Sheep's wool had turned a sickly gray color, and when she spoke, her voice echoed. Pedro Pony kept galloping in circles, faster and faster, until he became just a blur. The playground equipment had changed overnight. The slide was now impossibly tall, stretching up into the clouds. The swings moved by themselves, creaking back and forth with no one sitting on them. The seesaw balanced perfectly in the middle. Madame Gazelle tried to start the day with their usual song, but when she opened her mouth, no sound came out. She kept trying to sing, her mouth moving silently, her eyes growing wider. The children began to hum the melody themselves, but it came out wrong. During snack time, all the food tasted like cardboard and the juice had no color. When Peppa looked closely at her apple, she could see tiny doors and windows carved into its surface. Sometimes she thought she could hear tiny voices calling for help. The classroom walls began to stretch and bend, making the room feel much larger. The children's drawings on the wall started to move and change, the crayon figures walking from one picture to another, their paper faces turning to watch the real children. When it was time to go home, the parents who came to collect the children looked almost right, but not quite. They had the correct faces and voices, but their shadows fell in the wrong directions, and their reflections showed different people. The walk home felt endless, even though they took the same path as always. The familiar houses looked slightly different, as if someone had moved them. The trees whispered secrets in a language that almost made sense. Back in their house, everything was exactly where it should be, but nothing felt the same. The family photos on the mantelpiece showed the same faces, but the expressions had changed. In some pictures, they were smiling too widely. As night fell, Peppa and George went to bed as usual, but sleep felt different. Their dreams were filled with endless corridors and rooms that led to more rooms, all decorated exactly like their house, but stretching on forever. When morning came, everything returned to normal, or at least it seemed to. But Peppa couldn't shake the feeling that they were all still dreaming, and that the real world was somewhere else entirely.
Peppa Pig, the mud creature. It all started after 3 days of heavy rain. Water trickled down the windows, the wind bent the trees, and the entire backyard turned into a soggy mess. When the rain finally stopped, the sky cleared, the sun shone bright, but the ground stayed wet for a long time. Peppa and George ran outside. They laughed, jumped in puddles, splashed through the soft mud. But near the fence, a strange pit appeared. Inside was a dark, thick, almost black slime. It was too deep for a regular puddle, and the edges looked like something had been digging from within. "Don't go near that," said Mummy Pig. "It's too muddy even for you." Peppa peered into the pit. Something was moving, bubbling, but not like water, more like something alive was writhing beneath. The next day, the sun got stronger. All the backyard mud dried up, the puddles disappeared, all but one. The pit remained. It grew darker. It didn't reflect the sky. It looked like a black mirror. That night, Peppa woke up. The room was quiet, too quiet. George was breathing slowly, but outside, there were no stars. The sky was just gone. Peppa walked to the window and saw it, a figure standing in the pit, shaped like her, same form, same dress, only made of slime, the color of wet, dark earth. Its face was smooth, glossy, but had no eyes, just two deep black hollows, empty. "Peppa," the creature said, slowly, with pauses, as if it was trying to remember how to speak. The voice was hers, but distorted, like someone had heard her during the day and was trying to copy. Peppa jumped away from the window and hid under her blanket. She didn't sleep until morning. The next day, the pit still hadn't dried up. Even the grass nearby had already cracked under their hooves. Daddy Pig brought a shovel, planning to fill it with dirt. But when he dug in, the shovel sank almost all the way down. "This isn't as shallow as it looks," he muttered. That night, George woke up in a panic. He cried that someone was looking through the window. It was Peppa, but not Peppa. Peppa looked and saw the creature no longer in the pit. It stood on the path, closer. Its eyes glinted with the porch light. It didn't move, only its lips twitched. Slowly, a pause, then again, Pepe. On the third day, muddy footprints appeared at the front door. Mummy thought George had gotten dirty, but the prints were too large, almost adult-sized. Daddy Pig began to worry. He tried pouring a bucket of sand into the pit. It vanished, completely. No splash, no gurgle. That night, Peppa woke again. On her pillow, a dark drop. It smelled like swamp water, and on the floor, near the bed, a footprint. Just one. Wet. Peppa flinched and looked toward the door. It was ajar, and behind it, a shadow. Still. Silent. "I see you." The creature kept copying her voice, clumsily, with pauses, like it was still learning to be her. On the fourth night, Peppa awoke to a strange sound, a scraping, from downstairs. She crept into the living room. The window was slightly open. The room smelled damp, and on the glass, drawn with a muddy hoof, was a message. "I am Peppa." Daddy Pig tried to find the pit in the morning, but in its place was only a crack in the soil, and around it, footprints leading toward the house. Peppa didn't say anything, but that evening, when she looked into the mirror, it was fogged, and in the reflection behind her, someone stood, smiling, silently, and her own hoof was stained with mud. Even though she hadn't left the house all day,